Okay, I think we are live. So good morning, everybody. My name is Tumurbat, and today I'm going to be moderating the Exploring the Depths, Navigating the Complexities of Deep Sea Mining panel. And before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about us. Nomadic Venture Partners is an early stage climate tech fund focused on decarbonizing mining, manufacturing and transportation. We invest in pre-seed, seed, and Series A stage companies here in the US. And I'm here with my business partner, Bachimi, today. And one of the reasons why we actually wanted to host this webinar is because we received a number of inquiries from the climate tech community wanting to learn more about deep sea mining. So we invited some of the most experienced people and knowledgeable people in the industry to discuss this topic, and we hope you will enjoy it. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to quickly introduce everybody. I'll read off their brief descriptions and in bio. We have Dr. Samantha Smith here. She is the head of sustainability and external relations at Global Sea Mineral Resources and the director of Blue Globe Solutions Incorporated. She has about 22 years of experience conducting environmental assessments in a number of countries, covering 4 continents, and has 17 years of experience working with the deep seafloor minerals sector. She's the president of the International Marine Minerals Society, an international advisory board member of the Lyell Center for Earth and Marine Science, and a fellow of OSM. Next, we have Dr. Thomas Peacock of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is a professor of mechanical engineering at MIT. He's also a fellow of the American Physical Society and recipient of an NSF Career Award in Physical Oceanography. Over the past 20 years, he has conducted numerous field programs throughout the global oceans. And over the past decade, his research program has conducted and published very interesting leading studies of the deep sea mining sediment plumes. Next, we have Erica Ocampo. She is the Chief Sustainability Officer of the Metals Company. And as the Chief Sustainability Officer, Erica is responsible for ensuring the company's strategy aligns with sustainability principles and developing partnerships with stakeholders to advance TMC's sustainability goals. With over a decade of experience in sustainability strategy and engineering. And last but not least, we have Oliver Gunasekara. He is the CEO and co-founder of Impossible Metals Incorporated. His company is on the road to building a 21st century responsible mining company where the technology they're developing looks to harvest polymetallic nodules without harming the environment. The metals company was also a part of the Y Combinator. And with that, I'd like to kick off the discussion and get into the questions we have developed here. The first question I want to ask Erica. Why should we consider collecting polymetallic nodules? How could seabed mining help the energy transition?
Hello, everybody. We know that the energy transition is metal intensive, and we are embarking into this multi-generational project to decarbonize the global energy and transport, which will take billions of tons of metals to build, requiring a 5-fold increase in the supply of metals. Energy transition technologies require metals such as copper, nickel, cobalt, lithium, graphite, and manganese. And to give you a better view of the magnitude of the materials needed, in the next 30 years, the world is expected to mine 2 times more nickel than in the last 120 years. And since we tend to dig up the good stuff first, due to the lower grades, we are going to be generating almost 10 times more nickel tailings. So before I go into why polymetallic nodules, I think it's important to make a very relevant distinction of the types of mining and mineral resources when talking about deep sea mining. There are at least 3 types of deep sea minerals. We have cobalt crust, seafloor massive sulfides, and polymetallic nodules. They contain different metals, are found at different depths, in different ecosystems, and require different mining technologies. And today we are talking specifically about polymetallic nodules, which are these potato-sized rocks sitting unattached at 4 to 6 kilometers depth on the ocean floor. These nodules have high concentrations of nickel, cobalt, copper, and manganese, which are metals widely used in active cathode materials for nickel-rich cathode chemistries, the lithium-ion batteries. And the entire mass of these rocks can be turned into usable products. This means no mine waste or tailings. So, and since we're able to collect nodules without drilling, digging, or blasting from an area that does not have a rainforest or a coral reefs or a human settlement, I will say that those are pretty relevant reasons why we should consider polymetallic nodules as one of the sources to secure the energy transition metals.
Wonderful. That was a very good overview of the different types of seabed mining that we have, and specifically focusing on these polymetallic nodules. I want to turn over the discussion over to Oliver. If you can tell us a little bit about these polymetallic nodules and where they're located. I'm curious.
Yeah, I'm actually holding one up here. So they're small potato-sized rocks. They form over millions of years. So basically, they're underwater volcanoes. They take the trace metals from the core of the planet and put them into solution, and then around a crust, like a piece of clay or a piece of shell, they solidify. So they actually grow about a diameter every million years. And they're basically found on what we call the abysmal plains. So these are very, very deep and very flat parts of the world's oceans. And most of the world's oceans, we've actually found them. In fact, there's been studies that have been done by the US Geological Survey that shows that this is the world's biggest resource of nickel and cobalt. And there's also copper and manganese. We'll put the link to that peer review paper in the show notes. And what's nice about this resource is that it just lies on the seabed floor. So there's no blasting or cutting as is used in traditional mining. You literally just have to pick them off the seabed. You get 4 metals in one: nickel, cobalt, copper, and manganese, all of them very important in the transition to clean energy. And you find them in relatively high grades. And that, combined with the fact that you don't need to build huge amounts of infrastructure, means that they become a very valuable resource that will really help us move away from fossil fuels.
One thing you've mentioned that was really interesting and caught my attention was, I think you said these nodules have higher concentration of these metals. Can you give us a comparison of what we're talking about here? How concentrated are they?
Yeah, I mean, it varies a little bit by location. But if we talk about the nickel content in an area called the CCZ, that's the area between Hawaii and Mexico, the nickel content is about 1.6%. And obviously, you can find even higher grade on land, but most of that resource has already been mined. And so a lot of new mines that are in the process of being permitted inland can be at 0.2, 0.3%.
Wow.
And so that's significantly higher. And then you also have a credit for the cobalt, for the copper, for the manganese. So the nickel equivalent grade could be as high as 3.2% if you get a credit for those other metals.
Wonderful. That was very helpful for me to put it into context. Sam, what are some of the things you can tell us about the sea floor environment where these polymetallic nodules are found?
So to start with, to look at a photo of the abyssal seafloor covered by nodules doesn't honestly look like much. And in fact, the backdrop to this meeting shows I know it's an artist's rendition, but shows a view of what it looks like. So you can, for the viewers, sort of imagine a seemingly endless sandy looking floor covered with blackish brown golf ball to potato sized rocks. And life doesn't always appear visible in the photos or videos we take. And that's because most of the life that is there exists in the sediments, and the life is extremely small. So these probably aren't what we are used to describing as lush habitats, with lush being a word often used to describe ecosystems like rainforests, mangroves, even coral reefs. And the abyssal plains of the Clarion-Clipperton zone are dark and food poor, but there are complex ecosystems home to a high diversity of often small life forms adapted to the deep sea environment, which is an environment entailing cold temperatures, high pressure, no sunlight, and little food. And this results in life that is slow growing. I will add too that the abyssal plains lie at the bottom of the ocean floor, and the polymetallic nodules occur at a depth of about 4,000 to 6,000 meters below the sea's surface. So they're not that easy to get to, and they exist well below or beyond the limits of human divers. And so explorers and researchers rely on specialized ultra deep water equipment to explore and research these depths, such as robots called remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs. And ROVs are equipped with lights and cameras so we can see what's there. So that's why we do have a sense of what is there. They also have sensors that can study the environment, and robot arms and hands and sample boxes that allow us to take and store samples for further study. And we can use these robots and lots of other equipment to study the deep sea, to help continually improve our understanding of what it's like down there, and to ultimately inform environmental management decisions.
I think that's a really good segue into the question that I have prepared for Tom, which addresses if you can tell us a little bit about these types of technologies. I guess give us an overview, right? What are we talking about, and how do we actually think about harvesting polymetallic nodules off the deep seafloor here?
Yeah, there's actually quite a rich history of the technology development. You can go back to even the late 1960s, and the 1970s were an era that was referred to as kind of the pioneer era, where the first technology trials were done in the abyssal ocean. And in this case, people used different approaches to collect the nodules from the seabed. So really, the process is broken down into three sort of sections, if you will. You've got to have a collection system that goes down to the deep seabed to collect these nodules. And so that could be a vehicle that uses a hydrodynamic kind of a underwater equivalent of a vacuum cleaner type approach to picking up the nodules. Or we have a mechanical pickup system where a kind of like a rake or a tine or something like that is used to pick up the nodules. And then recently, Oliver's company is looking at using grippers to individually pick up the nodules. So there's different types of pickup systems. Then you have to get these nodules from the seabed up to the surface. So you have to have a vertical transport system. Again, different technologies have been looked at. The two sort of most common ones are to use a riser pipe, similar to the technology that's been developed for offshore oil and gas, to get material from the bottom out of the pipeline to the surface. Another approach is to use buoyancy, so to actually have the vehicles that are doing the nodule collecting rise up and down through the water column. Again, that's the approach that is being used by or proposed by Oliver's company to do that. And there was there's a French company in the 1980s that also looked at a similar approach there. And then once the nodules are up the surface, then they have to be shipped to shore. And whether that's via there's a transfer from your collection vessel off to another vessel to then ship the nodules to shore, or the same vessel that you use to deploy your technology is the vessel that does the transport back to shore as well. So there's different ways to do it, and people are looking at these different ways and trying to figure out what works.
Have you seen any other different, other approaches? I guess my question is right, we're an investor and we're looking for all kinds of interesting technologies to invest in. And I know we have three companies here who have slightly different versions of the system that you've talked about, how you pick up these nodules as well as you bring it up to the surface. Any other exciting sort of techniques or approaches people have been looking at recently? I'm just curious. I don't know how much innovation is going on in this space, but it seems like lots of people are interested in getting into this space.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of innovation around across all different areas: the collection systems, the vertical transport, etc. So yeah, I mean, watch this space. I think there's new ideas coming up all the time about how to do things. So I can't give specific examples of other companies or other entities to go and take a look into, but I will say from our close involvement with the field, there are several different entities that are looking to do things in different ways.
Okay. Can I maybe do this, right? Since we have 3 different companies here who have, I think, based on my understanding, have slightly different approaches, without spending too much time, could each one of you quickly describe your technologies in a little bit more detail so that our readers or audience gets a better picture? Maybe, Oliver, can I start with you?
Yeah, we decided to try a different approach from the dredging and riser pump system that was tested by Lockheed Martin in the 1970s. And so our approach is really a fleet of autonomous underwater vehicles. So these are robots that are battery powered, and they descend to the depths and then hover. So they don't actually land. And so we're trying to minimize any of the sediment disruption. So they hover above the resource, and then they use cameras and lights to look at all of the nodules one by one, and we pick them up. And because the vehicle is quite large and has lots of arms, we can pick up lots of material. If we see visible signs of life, a coral, a sponge, etc., growing out of the nodule, we will leave it behind. We won't pick it. And then once the payload is full, the vehicle uses its battery pack and buoyancy engine to move up the water column where it's recovered. And every few hours, the vehicle can be reused. And so by using a fleet of these vehicles, we can pick up millions of tons of material.
Okay, that's very interesting. Erica, how about your company?
We partnered with All Seas, and All Seas has developed. We partnered with the company called All Seas.
Okay.
And then we have developed this collector vehicle that basically applies a parallel to the surface of the seafloor water jet that lifts the nodules up, then are sucked into the collector vehicle, and then transported through the vertical riser all the way to the top. But to your question about the technologies, I think is not just the collector itself, but the technologies attached with the entire offshore operations that can be of interest to investors, because we're talking about improvements on reduction of emissions for vessels, right? Decarbonization of vessels. We're talking about how can we do something different, because one of the major sources of fuel usage is the positioning of the vessel. Is there another technology to do that? Different system for pump to use on the riser pipes. So we see we are using technologies that exist that have proven, we just had the collector pilot test run last year, and we were able to prove this concept. So I think as the industry evolves and develops, there's going to be a lot more concepts that are going to continue to develop with it, but not just of the vehicle or the collector's vehicle itself, but the entire suite of technology around the offshore.
Got it. That's helpful. Samantha?
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what Erica said. There's a whole suite of research and development going on. The GSR collection mechanism involves a tracked vehicle that has a hydraulic collector head, and the collector heads themselves don't touch the seafloor. They sort of suck the nodules up from the seabed, again with the goal of taking as little sediment with it as possible. In the GSR case, we have chosen a riser to bring the nodules up to the surface, and the reason for that is to minimize any interaction with seabed material with the water column as the material goes up to the surface vessel. And then, yeah, that's basically it. And then on board from the surface vessel, nodules would then be transported to a land-based processing facility to get the metals out, to put it simply.
And is it safe to say that most of these companies, or maybe all of them, aren't really focused on processing the nodules, right, on ship, right? I think.
Oh, not on ship, no. So that's right. So I think at this stage, all companies are looking to take the material to a land-based processing facility for many, many reasons, but one being the requirement for a stable environment.
Got it. So it sounds like many of you are thinking about potentially mining these polymetallic nodules, right? It sounds like you guys have this have a very strong focus on the environmental or the potential environmental impacts, right? I think we've briefly talked about, plumes being created or dust being sort of uplifted from the seabed floor there. Maybe I want to segue into that. Sam, I'll just ask you this question. What are the expected environmental impacts of this type of mining process? And can we, safely assume that it can be mined responsibly?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sam. Thanks. And I think before I get into deep seabed minerals, I think some context is needed, and I'll touch on land-based minerals first. And some of this was already touched on, and I think more detail will be coming as we progress with the webinar. But to reach ores on land, often a top layer of earth must be removed. This can require explosives, drilling, and it can create mountains of waste because there's a lot of material that has to be removed that isn't wanted. And something has to happen with that. And after the ores are processed to get the metals out, some of this waste, which is known as tailings, which can be toxic, ends up being disposed of either on land or at sea, either directly or indirectly via rivers. And by contrast, oceanic nodules, as already mentioned, I think by Oliver before, lie loose on the seafloor of the seabed. So no explosives, no drilling, no cutting are required to collect them. Also, valorization tests are ongoing with the aim of ensuring that all components of a nodule are saleable and are usable, and the production of tailings may be able to be avoided altogether. And if this turns out to be possible, this could represent a step change for mineral production of these particular metals. I think it's also important to know that despite lying almost 5 kilometers below the ocean's surface, polymetallic nodules are in some ways more accessible than terrestrial alternatives. So for example, there's no obstructions to accessing them. No forests need to be removed. No people need to be relocated. No local power stations or transport infrastructure needs to be built. The surface vessel can sail to the nodule fields and commence operations once the seabed mining equipment has been deployed. But it's also important to remember that mineral deposits, whether they are found on land or on the seafloor, form on geological timescales, and the environmental effects of extracting them, such as habitat and biota removal, could be long-lasting. And with any mining project, of course, the benefit of obtaining the minerals must outweigh the environmental costs. We know that for polymetallic nodules, a key environmental management strategy entails establishing designated set-aside areas, including within a contract area. And setting the right areas aside needs scientific input to ensure representative habitat and biota are protected, and to help ensure biodiversity and ecosystem health and function are maintained on a regional scale. And the International Seabed Authority, which I'm sure we'll talk about more in a minute, has to date established 13 of these set-aside areas, which they've called areas of particular environmental interest, which collectively serve to protect over 40% of the Clarion-Clipperton zone. And contractors must also establish preservation reference zones within their contract areas, also to contribute to this network of representative set-aside areas, so areas that have representative habitat and biota. And I think another important aspect for us to be able to demonstrate that this can be done responsibly is the ability to demonstrate that environmental effects can be accurately predicted and monitored. And one key way that this is achieved is through monitored field trials and industry academic collaborations to conduct not only the environmental baseline studies, but also environmental monitoring. And this is something that has been happening and has become something of an industry standard. It's something that I've spent my career sort of helping to build and develop, and it's something that I'm personally very proud to be involved with. So, the bottom line is, a lot of thought is going into developing this industry, and certainly with environment and ocean health front and center of mind.
Got it. That's very helpful. I want to maybe take the conversation and and bring in Tom here quickly, because I know he's done a lot of work on midwater plumes. And then since Samantha, you've mentioned some of these potential impacts, I think that one is something that people have been thinking about and wondering what would happen. So Tom, could you tell us about the work that you've been doing to monitor these plumes? First of all, how do we create these things? I guess if you've touched on the technology right earlier, so if you can maybe talk about why this could be created and what you're doing to help study and understand how these plumes move in sea.
Yeah, of course. That's been a focus of our research program, and basically the sediment on the deep sea bed is quite very mobile. It's not very stuck to the seabed, shall we say. So if you have a vehicle that's operating in the vicinity of the seabed and picking up nodules by some mechanism, there's going to be some disturbance created, and so one of the focuses of our study has been what could be the scale of those disturbances on the seabed, because once you disturb the sediment, the concern is that certainly there's going to be settling of sediment locally, and some of our recent studies have shown just how much, quite a large percentage of the sediment does settle locally, but some will remain in the water column and can be carried away by ocean currents to settle elsewhere or impact water quality elsewhere. So the question is, how far would that be? What's the potential scale of that? And the other type of plume, so that's in the vicinity of the seabed. And then another consideration by some mining operations is once the nodules go up to the surface vessel, they would be unloaded there, but there might be some dewatering is a process that's referred to there, that there's some water that comes up a riser pipe perhaps with the nodules, and the question is what happens to that water. And so there's a consideration whether that gets released back down at mid-ocean, sort of 2,000, 3,000 meters, certainly below where there's the photic zone, so below where there's light, and to try and minimize impacts, or could be returned all the way back down to the deep seabed where the mining operation, the collection operation is taking place. So these are the two types of plumes. You can also think a little bit to what activity is going on at the surface as well, but that's not been a focus of studies yet. So we've conducted sort of the major trials of this to date. So we've done studies of midwater plumes in the middle of the water column. We've been involved with 2 technology trials for technologies operating down on the seabed, and we're developing a thorough understanding of what sets the scales of these plumes, what are the key parameters. To ask the simple question like how big are the plumes, there's so many factors that go into answering that question. It's going to depend hugely on the technology that's used. It's going to depend on how the technology is operated. It's going to depend on what is deemed a threshold of sediment, say suspension in the water column, that is believed or understood to have negative consequences for the environment down there. So you can't really answer the simple question of like how big are these plumes going to be or how small are they going to be, because it depends on all those factors. But we're developing the capability, and we have several academic studies out there, and I've given several presentations on okay, here's what influences the scales, these are the most important things. And so I think we've been involved in the sediment plume studies really very, very actively, because I think there's a lot of discussion about them broadly surrounding seabed mining, and I don't think all of the discussions have been fully grounded in sort of scientific studies. So our goal was always to be to sort of really determine what sets the scale of these and how they can be influenced.
So for the average, I guess, listener, right? Like, can you kind of give us a scale of how geometrically, right? How big could these plumes be? How fast they move? How fast they settle, and then so on? Is that
I mean, I can give you some examples. So for example, we were out and we did a monitoring operation of the technology trials for GSR in 2021 for their collector vehicle, and there was also a consortium of 29 independent European scientists that were on the vessel and doing the monitoring. And so in that case, for that technology and for that style of operations, the initial sediment plume was, we'd say, low-lying, and it was on the scale of the height of the collector vehicle. So it was about 3 or 4 or 5 meters off the bottom there, which was much lower than the kind of numbers that have been thrown out there in terms of what the scale was. The concentrations of sediment, so there's a lot of deposition locally. We found that between 92 to 98% of the sediment that was picked up with the nodules lay below 2 meters or was deposited locally. And the kind of concentrations that were in the water column that were carried away by the ocean currents. So the ocean currents are about a few centimeters per second down there. So they carry some of the sediment away. So the concentrations there were about a few milligrams per liter, and this is the same kind of numbers that have come from other studies or even been seen back in the 1970s. So I guess just to try and give people some perspective, if you had a sample that was 1 milligram per liter, then you wouldn't see that if you're holding up a bottle. Like, you wouldn't notice it, and that's like 0.001%, something of that order, volume of sediment in there. Now, just to give some balance, because it's still being discussed and understood, the natural levels of sediment in the water column in the deep ocean, and indeed throughout the CCZ broadly, are about 10 micrograms per liter. So that's about 100 times lower than 1 milligram per liter. A big question is, does a sediment concentration level between 10 micrograms per liter and 1 milligram per liter have impact? That's a question for the biologist there.
That's very interesting. So it sounds like your technology, at least the ones you've used to do the study, has this ability to actually track something so dilute or so low in concentration. That's at least one of the takeaways.
Relative to term, right? So it depends.
Sure.
The science has to determine what concentrations of sediment cause impact, and that has a big effect on what you might consider the scale of the plume to be.
Got it. Okay. Oliver, I want to ask you the next question here. So we've just talked about these plumes, right? What about noise, right? Because in land-based or terrestrial mining, I used to be a mining engineer, worked at a mine site. I know how loud these pieces of equipment can be, right? Honking and when big haul trucks are moving by, right, causing noise. Is that something that is also present in this type of mining? I assume there would be. And can you talk to us a little bit about what happens and how it could affect the environment if there is such noise in subsea?
Yeah, I mean, noise in the ocean has a capability to move quite a long distance, and the biggest concerns we have is about the marine mammals that live in the ocean, the dolphins, the whales, the other forms that could be affected. Now, the first thing to say is that these mammals spend the majority of their time in shallow water. And also the way that the mining equipment is constructed, the ship is likely to generate the vast majority of the noise pollution. Because it's so large, and depending on what technology you're using, you may need dynamic positioning. Dynamic positioning is an ability of a ship to stay very, very still by using thrusters and propellers. Unfortunately, it's incredibly noisy. And so the challenge is, how do we minimize the noise footprint at the surface? The collector vehicle is relatively small, and with all approaches, whether it's the dredging approach or our selective harvest approach, is unlikely to generate very large amount of noise compared to the support vessel. One of the benefits of our approach, again, is that we don't need dynamic positioning because our vehicles are fully autonomous and untethered. And so that reduces the noise. But it's definitely something that all companies are committed to minimizing and monitoring. But I think the vast majority of the noise will come at the surface level. The riser pump system does need pumps every certain distance, and so you will get additional noise being generated as each of those pumps are operated. But it is something that we do need to care about, and there is work ongoing to try to minimize the noise footprint as well as the light pollution as well.
Does any of the other panelists have any thoughts on this too? I think that was Oliver's company's approach, but I think I want to hear maybe Erica's or Samantha's response to this, and then I'd love to just hear your perspective.
I think, it's true that is that level of noise and the dynamic positioning is definitely one of the major sources. I think it's important to put it within a context. When you look at terrestrial mining, we're already talking that there is no need for drilling or blasting, which is probably the highest level of noise you will find in an operations. You don't find it here. So yes, there is a level of noise, but by comparison, it's smaller. And there are definitely focus being done on the reduction of the noise, and also not just the noise, but the tracking of the migration routes to see when and how much we could actually impact these mammals.
Have there been any sort of studies maybe done by you or other groups to really understand how far these noise? I guess I'm probably talking about. I'm trying to maybe understand it in perspective like decibels, right, and how far it could propagate through the sea, and if you had a location in a middle of the sea, right, and if you had sort of a population of dolphins above that, right, 2, 3, maybe 4, 5,000 meters above the mining activity, could they actually hear this, or it sort of propagates out as?
So I think it's an order of magnitude larger noise from the ship, the dynamic positioning. So it would drown out any of the noise from the collector vehicle, and it's much closer. Dolphins are going to spend the vast majority of their time in shallow water.
That makes sense. I know you briefly touched on this, Erica, the difference between terrestrial mining as well as seabed mining. Is there anything else that people should understand? I think we saw a question in the comment section here asking, right, like what are the production levels? That's probably one way to kind of compare. But then also, from an impact perspective, right, if you have so much volume that we're maybe not mining because it's so concentrated, could there be, I guess, an argument that this is arguably a better approach?
So actually today, TMC released a third-party review. If you can put the link on the chat, that would be great. This was third-party review life cycle assessment, and it was completed by Benchmark Mineral Intelligence on the impacts of the NORI-D project itself and how it compares to producing the same metals from conventional land ores using typical terrestrial routes. In this cradle-to-gate LCA, we look at the nickel, cobalt, and copper products derived from this NORI-D project, and it performed better in almost every impact category of the ones analyzed, except for the global warming potential and the water consumption of producing cobalt sulfate, where the one of the routes performed better. So I'm gonna leave you with that hinge there, so you actually go and look at the summary report. But some of the main reasons for why this project has lower emissions in most impact categories is due for many of the things we have mentioned, is that we're able to collect these nodules without blasting or drilling, and no sulfuric tailings are produced because we can actually utilize the entire nodule. And other reasons for this lower environmental burden include differences on the decisions we make. So for example, TMC has developed near zero waste onshore processing. And also we have committed to have renewable electricity, and we have been able to design a process with lower energy demand. And because these nodules, are high revenue, high volume co-products, and high metal recovery rates, we're talking that the environmental burdens are distributed. So when you have 4 metals in one ore, you're already, by nature of the concentration, you're already getting more value out of what you take out, and therefore the environmental burden reduces. So I will say those are like the key areas to compare. Obviously, not just the nature of the nodule, but as I mentioned, the decisions we make on how we collect and process these nodules are very valuable. And by us having this kind of foresight into these impacts, we are able to actually adapt this profile to better perform before any commercial operation actually takes place. You are on mute, Tim.
Thank you very much, Eric. I really appreciate the response there. I think a very interesting study I think you've mentioned that's been published by Benchmark. I'll have to go and then read that. I want to maybe transition the discussion over to maybe permitting, right? I see some questions here about who has the authority, right? Who gives these permits? I think a lot of people are wondering that question as well. So maybe Sam, could you tell us a little bit about this group that I think somebody mentioned earlier, right? International Seabed Authority, right? Who are they? What do they do? And why is this important in today's discussion?
Yeah, sure. So it's important to understand that no state or entity can commercially explore the international seabed area or collect nodules except under contract with the International Seabed Authority, or ISA. And the ISA is mandated through the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, to organize, regulate, and control all mineral-related activities in the international seabed area, and for the benefit of humankind as a whole, which is an important concept or important part of how the ISA works. The ISA was established in 1994 through UNCLOS and its implementation agreement. To date, the ISA has awarded 17 exploration contracts in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, and the contractors who hold these 15-year licenses represent nations including China, Japan, Russia, France, UK, Korea, Germany, Poland, Cook Islands, Nauru, and Belgium, among others. So there's lots of countries that are involved. All exploration contract holders are currently undertaking geological and environmental studies as part of their contractual obligations. And the ISA is currently in the process of developing regulations for commercial activity, for mining. And any contractors wishing to undertake mining operations in the international deep seabed area will need to abide by these strict regulations, along with the standards and guidelines that are being developed. The regulations themselves incorporate specific provisions to ensure the effective protection of the marine environment and conservation of marine biodiversity, as well as human health and safety. And there's also incorporated a system of payments which aims to ensure the equitable sharing of financial and other economic benefits derived from deep seabed minerals. The regulations must be agreed and adopted by the ISA Council, and there are a number of bodies that make up the ISA, so it's Council that adopt the regulations. And then what Council adopts then must be approved by the ISA Assembly, which is comprised of 167 member states and the European Union.
That sounds like a lot of parties are involved, and based on your experience, right, how well has this, government body have been, I guess, working, right? I mean, to have this many parties involved, one could assume, right? Is it really hard to actually have anything implemented? In other countries, right? Countries may have different views on how they want to maybe, right, exploit their own resources. So maybe tell us a little bit about how maybe bureaucratic that process could be. It sounds like only 17 exploration licenses have been granted. That, to me, it sounds very, very few. I mean, people might be thinking, oh gosh, there are hundreds of these licenses that are owned and operated by many of these companies, which might be the wrong idea. But yeah, could you maybe tell us a little bit about the
Sure. Well, it's
about how
not.
they work?
I think it's not a super fast process because everybody gets a say and everybody eventually needs to agree. I've been going to the International Seabed Authority meetings. This will be my 14th year going, and of course, delegations change hands as well. So sometimes there's a learning curve that also gets involved. But overall, what it should result in is extremely robust regulations, and they are available on the ISA's website. So and they have been available for stakeholder comment as well, and they are probably a lot more finalized than people realize, or a lot more complete than people realize. And yeah, negotiations are ongoing, and it should be an example of a way to govern the world's resources where a lot of countries get to have a say, not just one.
Thank you, Samantha. Erica, can I ask you a question with respect to these mining licenses? How many entities, right? How many entities have been granted a seabed mining license, right? I think Samantha just talked about these 17 exploration licenses. I'm curious if anyone's actually got a mining license today.
Yeah, that's an easy answer. Zero. As today, there is not commercial deep sea mining happening. So the ISA, and if you can put the link to the ISA exploration licenses, there have been. Can you hear that?
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. So there have been, if you see on the link, you can see that there have been granted 31 exploration contracts to date. So of these ones, 19 are for polymetallic nodules alone, because it's really the resource where people are really after. And as Samantha was mentioning, the only way that private companies or public companies can access this research is through the sponsorship of a member state. So yeah, that gives you a little view of what is happening around the licensing.
Okay, that's very interesting. I'm surprised to hear that there's no one that has a mining license. With all the sort of talk in the media, I suspected maybe there were at least a couple companies actually already mining this, but I'm surprised to learn that. Oliver, can you talk to us, tell us a little bit about the ISA's authority, specifically when it comes to how it works with these, I think it's called exclusive economic zones, or EEZs, right? And what's happening in those sort of zones today? Who has the higher authority, right? I think Erica just gave us a really good understanding, so did Samantha, on the ISA's authority. But I've heard that there are these exclusive zones that certain countries have, and they have basically 100% authority over who makes a decision. Is that true, or is that not the case here?
It's generally true. So under the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, that's the 1982 legal framework that 167 countries have signed, plus the EU, it divides the oceans into basically two buckets from a legal framework. So there are areas beyond national jurisdiction, so that's otherwise called the high seas, and so that is international waters, and there's a whole bunch of rights of what you can do. And when it comes to seabed minerals, it's exclusively administered and regulated by the ISA, the International Seabed Authority. So that's international waters. But what about domestic waters? 200 nautical miles off the coast is typically called the exclusive economic zone, or the EEZ, of a country. And that belongs to the country. And the country gets to decide, as if it was their sovereign land, what they do. And so some countries, like the US, like the Cook Islands, have passed legislation and established domestic regulators to regulate seabed minerals in the same way that the ISA is attempting to regulate seabed minerals in international waters. In the case of the Cook Islands, they passed their legislation around 2010. They established a regulatory entity called the Seabed Minerals Authority, and that it has issued last year 3 exploration permits. So these are the first step. They don't allow any commercial mining, but they allow science. They allow people to measure the resource and do environmental baselines and create the environmental impact of mining, which would then happen at a further stage. In the US, the regulatory body is called the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM. It's part of the US Department of the Interior. Again, in the 1970s, there was a Hard Rock Mineral Act passed that gave authority from Congress to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. Norway and Japan and India are in the process. They don't yet have legislation on their statute books, but they have started the public consultation. And so it is likely in the next few years they will have the legislation and the regulatory body established. And other countries are also following. So it's important for people to understand what happens at the ISA is for international waters. Countries can choose to follow that, but in the case of the US, which is not a member of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, it has no obligation to follow, and so is completely writing its own rules and has its own mechanisms. And so, you know, you really do have to think about those 2 jurisdictions, international and domestic. And domestic could be dozens of countries, of which already 3 have the legislations in place.
That's very interesting. I think that distinction is sometimes or misunderstood. I initially didn't know, but it looks like, right, as long as you're maybe in an island nation, right, you have this exclusive zone that's around you, and you get to dictate. But in the case of Cook Islands, they're choosing to go by the ISA's regulation. Is that correct?
In the case of the Cook Islands, it's a small nation state, but they have multiple 13 islands or so. And so their exclusive economic zone is actually very, very large. It's approximately half the size of the Clarendon-Clipperton zone, the CCZ. So it's a huge area, about half the size of the continental USA. That's the size of their exclusive economic zone. So very, very large. As I said, they established the legislation in around the 2010. They have called the Seabed Minerals Authority. As a member of the ISA, they will track and follow. But if the ISA, for whatever reason, decides not to approve regulations, it doesn't stop the Cook Islands from putting out their own regulations. It's their own sovereign state. They can do what they wish in their area. Got
it. That's very helpful. Appreciate that, Oliver. Tom, I want to shift the discussion a little bit. I think I saw somewhere someone mentioning, cost of these things, right? CapEx, OpEx. How do we think about these types of deposits, competitiveness? Can you tell us a little bit about MIT's work on these cost curves and competitiveness of these kinds of projects?
Yeah, certainly. I'll be just quite concise. So a team from MIT developed a financial model to help guide the payment regime decisions of the International Seabed Authority. And so that's looking at CapEx, OpEx, many of the topics that obviously go into building an economic model. I think the bottom line really is that the economics of nodule mining in the CCZ, we haven't done it for the Cook Islands, but it appears to be very competitive. A big benefit of the nodule mining is that it's this 4-in-1 mineral deposit. You get the nickel, you get the cobalt, you get the copper, you get the manganese. So this all contributes to a favorable economic environment for seabed mining. Roughly speaking, my understanding and what we've seen is that as a nickel project, it appears in the sort of the top quartile of nickel mining projects. So no commercial operations have taken place yet. So these numbers are projections, but the fact that it appears so competitive suggests that even if the numbers aren't exactly correct, there's a lot of space to still allow the economics to be what they're going to be, and this is going to be a very competitive mining project. So I think that's also a driver or consideration for seabed mining over land-based mining. And there are all of these reports that have been developed for the ISA are publicly available reports on the economics there, so those can be accessed.
Yeah, how could one access those? Is it on MIT's website?
No, it's through the ISA website. It will be there.
Through there. Got it. That's very interesting.
And there are a couple of publications out there as well that detail the economics of a nodule mining operation in the CCZ.
And that probably includes the downstream mineral processing on land, right? That probably doesn't look into a potentiality where you might actually consider processing it on ship. But I mean, that's the whole probably different discussion. But the models that, as you discussed today, don't include.
Correct. Yeah, all the modeling is assuming land-based processing facilities.
Got it. Which, yeah. Okay, that's very interesting. I think I may have just one more question before we maybe switch over to some of the questions we received through the comment section here. I'll give you the last question, or maybe second to last question to Samantha here. Could you discuss the UNCLOS concept, right, of benefit sharing? You've mentioned that briefly. I want to dig a little bit deeper into that concept. What does it mean for member states, in particular developing nations, when it comes to benefit sharing?
Yeah, thank you for that. So unlike on land, where typically a developer and a single nation benefit from a terrestrial mining project, importantly, under UNCLOS, the economic advantages of deep seabed mining are to be shared for the benefit of humankind as a whole, in the form of royalty payments and other contributions, with particular emphasis on developing countries. Additionally, the ISA's reserved areas mechanism is a key component of the system of access to the international seabed area and its mineral resources under UNCLOS. It's one of the ways UNCLOS ensures that developing countries access deep sea mineral resources. And to explain this a little better, an entity can apply to the ISA for a 15-year exploration contract in the area, provided it has been sponsored by an ISA member state. And as I mentioned, there are 167 member states and the EU. Each exploration contract initially gives access to a seabed region of 150,000 square kilometers. And this allocation must be divided by the contractor after doing some exploration work and some resource definition into two equal-sized parts of equal value. The ISA then chooses who gets which part, but the ISA grants one part to the contractor. So now the contractor has a 75,000 kilometer exploration contract area. And the other part is held in a site bank, which is reserved for access by developing countries, or the enterprise, which is the business arm of the ISA. And I think, while I've got the floor here, I'll also mention that besides the financial benefits, perhaps the most important benefit for humankind could be the metals themselves. Because if DSM does become an established industry, it will only do so because years of scientific research has demonstrated that the industry can deliver the metals needed for clean energy transition, for urbanized population growth, and sustainable development in a responsible way. And really the industry is being built with this aim to deliver metals with fewer emissions, with less waste, with better preservation of ecosystem health and function, compared with many of the alternatives. And I think we do have to bear in mind that, as we've discussed, metals are one of our biggest allies in the battle against climate change, but it does come at a cost. We are facing a sustainability paradox. In that there's no way of extracting this metal without some environmental effects. And so I think, the people that you have on this call, or at least those that work with or for companies, if the deep seabed can help us meet future metal demand in a more responsible way than alternatives, then that's a benefit for all of us. And so again, it's an option that we see as one that's important to explore.
Got it. Got it. I want to bring up Erica here quickly, and can you quickly talk about how would seabed mining help these developing nations that Samantha mentioned?
So creating shared value with developing countries to this industry, in particular with developing nations, is essential to fulfill the intent set on UNCLOS. So there is a real potential to have a large positive impact on developing nations through main sources. There are others, but these are the two main ones. The fees paid to them has collection fees and taxes and management fees, and the obligation under UNCLOS for capacity building for developing nations. So you have royalties and taxes, which is important to know that the agreement requires that the payments done should be within the ranges of those prevailing in respect of land-based mining on the same or similar minerals, in order to avoid giving deep sea minerals an artificial competitive advantage or imposing on them a competitive disadvantage. So that's important to know, that it's going to be very competitive. And when it comes to capacity building, there are different avenues that companies like TMC are looking to promote, which are training opportunities, such as at sea. So building the next workforce of this industry from developing nations through scholarships, either to develop the research groups or scientists of the future, or the needs for the developing nations for managers, teachers, doctors, all that, and community projects themselves, where we give grants to the communities. So all this is like an upside on the social aspect. That's how I see it.
Right, right. Can you maybe put it into context by comparing it to the royalties and taxes that countries collect from terrestrial mining, right? And see, okay, is this going to benefit them more, right? If they became a sponsoring state rather than developing a project, right, on land. Has, I guess, anyone done that type of a comparison of the economics?
So actually, these payments or these rates are currently being discussed at the ISA, which is meeting right now. But the point that has to be made once that decision is finalized is that it cannot be better or worse than terrestrial. So not to create this kind of artificial negative or positive impact for deep sea mining.
Got it. Okay. That's very helpful. I think we're at this time about 3 minutes over, but I do want to maybe take one question or two questions from the comment section here. Okay, here's one. Kyle asks, interested in what the panel think is the timeline of when a commercial scale mining permit will be issued by the ISA. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Well, I guess I should answer that, since TMC is the one that is preparing to be the first application to be submitted. So we are waiting or expecting for the mining code to be completed this year, in which moment the TMC will submit the application. The application is a multi-year kind of project to be completed, and we are getting ready to submit it at the end of this year. Assuming that it takes a year for the ISA to review it and hopefully approve it, we are looking towards the end of 2024, beginning of 2025 to start operations, small-scale operations on the CCZ.
Okay. I guess from all the way from like starting, right, exploring to getting to that permit, it sounds a very lengthy process, very much like the one on land-based mining or terrestrial mining, which can take years, if not more than sometimes 15 years in certain cases. It sounds like it's sort of similar, but the code is, I guess, not quite being finalized yet. So I guess it'll be really interesting to see what happens with your company's application and use that as a test case to kind of project. I think the last question that I want to ask, this goes back to the UN. Andres, he asked, could you clarify the stance of the United States about the UN Seabed Authority? I think we're not a member of the ISA, right? It seems that the the U.S. is not a signatory, but rather an observer state with non-voting rights. Is that true? And how does
Yes.
that work?
I mean, that's exactly true. I mean, basically, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea has not been ratified by Congress. And so that means that the US cannot be a signatory, is not a signatory to UCOS, and hence cannot have full member status of the International Seabed Authority. It does have observer status. It does send a delegation. Obviously,
very large.
It can influence by being there and talking, but it doesn't have the legal status of being a member.
But that doesn't preclude them from benefiting from the resource itself, because a company like ours can easily bring this metal onshore the US.
Got it. Okay, I believe we're over time at this point. I really enjoyed the conversation. I couldn't believe that it's already over an hour. I think there are so many other topics that are still to be discussed. Maybe what we'll do is consider having a follow-on session on some of the other topics. I think one that is really interesting to me is drilling a little bit deeper down into the biodiversity. I know we touched on it briefly, but really understanding what do we not know, right? I think there's lots of sort of publications that talk about how we don't know a lot about how much marine biodiversity there is, especially at these kinds of depths. And there seems to be a bit of opposing views. So that's something that I'd love to understand a bit more. But any sort of parting thoughts before we wrap up this session from anyone?
I would say that, we ultimately need these metals. We have to get them from somewhere. And so trying to come up with a location and an approach that has the least harm to both the environment and people is, I think, what all of us are trying to do. I think we all believe that compared to going to a rainforest in Indonesia or using child labor in Africa, our approach of going to the seabed is vastly having less impact. And so, if we want to move away from fossil fuels, we need these metals. We've got to get them from somewhere. Recycling in 30 years, maybe, but not in the short term. There's just not enough material. So that's why I think we all believe that the seabed has great potential, because if not, we're going to create immense harm to the 29% of the surface area of our planet, which is where everybody lives.
Interesting. Well, thank you very much, Erica, Oliver, Samantha, and Tom. And again, audience, really appreciate you tuning in. Stay tuned for more webinars. I think we're going to be continuing to learn more and ask some of these really interesting questions around some of the topics we didn't get to discuss today, which hopefully we will. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.